Welcome to The Forum, your modern-day coffee house, where ideas can be birthed, exchanged, and wrestled with. We celebrate questions, conversation, and reason as powerful tools to enlighten hearts and transform minds, shaping a new generation of thinkers, innovators, and pioneers. We're glad you're here, so pull up a chair and let's begin.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm really pleased to be collaborating with Emel today. And we have titled our talk, Is Life Meaningless, or Is It Up to Us to Make It Matter? Now, whilst this has been a topic that has been discussed for centuries and centuries, you could even argue since the dawn of time, we thought we'd just fix it in the next hour. So, I saw a wonderful quote on X this week that said this: if you claim to be searching for meaning in life, but you're not willing to consider the meaning of your own desire to live, then what is it you are really searching for? Now, last year, some of you may remember that me and Kev had quite a long conversation about, is religion on the rise? And in that, we discussed many different ideas and concepts with regards to why religious institutions are actually increasing, despite us living in more of a secular society. So I thought for the first 15 minutes this morning, before I invite Emel to the stage, I would ask the question, is nihilism on the rise? And should it be mentioned on dating profiles? So what is nihilism? Nihilism simply means one believes all values are baseless, truth is subjective, and nothing can ever really be known or communicated. At the core of the nihilists, they feel pessimistic and skeptical about existence in its entirety. They have no loyalties, and subsequently, they have no purpose. It's quite sad, really, isn't it? Not nice. Now, a recent report shows that preteens spend about 5.5 hours in front of their screens daily. Daily. And those between 13 and 18, 8.5 hours per day. I couldn't believe it when I saw those statistics. I mean, just wild. Now, this can be movies, TV, but generally it swings towards things like social media, Instagram, X, Facebook, all of that kind of thing. Now, the sheer volume of information that's being exchanged at such a fast speed, psychologists are realizing it's actually starting to rewire people's brains in the way that they think, and ultimately it's causing their perception of reality to shift. When you have such an immense array of information and the decreasing mental capacity to know how to formulate your own ideas and thoughts, you begin to view everything through an apathetic lens. It's interesting that Jordan Peterson says something great. It says, first make your bed. Now, the idea of that is when you get up on a morning, take responsibility for doing that which you can do, and don't expand your vision to something so big where you feel like basically you feel inadequate. Now, the endless exposure of content leads to unrealistic expectations and endless comparisons that lead to the feeling of inadequacy. Now, the term nihilism was coined, interestingly, to say that we're a modern-day coffee house, and that came from the 17th and 18th century. The term nihilism was actually coined in 1733. However, it most certainly was prevalent prior to this word being used in 1733 as what we have to describe it today. Now, those of you who have either read or studied or heard of the Hebrew Bible, there's a book called Ecclesiastes, and I've mentioned this numerous times before. The opening statement of the book is this: meaningless, meaningless, utterly meaningless, everything is meaningless. Wow. Great way to start your day. Now, for those of you who are 40 and above, raise your hand. Huh? These words may resonate with you. Now, just hold on, I'll explain. When you hit the infamous midlife crisis. A feeling you may find hasn't subsided yet and that you wrestle with every day. Now, my personal experience with this, when I entered my 40s, having already deconstructed so much of what made me feel safe and secure, you could argue my meaning was found in external gratification and box ticking. When all this was called into question, it was the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak, especially for me and my experience. Now, whether for you it might have been empty nest syndrome, when your children left home, the loss of youth and vitality, the realization of one's own mortality, our sole meaning and purpose for life is challenged. Now, how do we wrestle with the tension of overwhelming uncertainty and change that comes with life's journey, whilst at the same time striving to transcend it? Now, this notion that life may be inherently meaningless has spurred generations of thinkers to grapple with this and what constitutes a meaningful life. As society moves away from religious narratives and embraces a more secular worldview, the question is this: if the divine no longer offers purpose, where do we find meaning? What are we striving for? What is the goal? Is it something built into the fabric of existence, or do we create it ourselves? Now, the conversation I had with Kev last year, the rise of the religious right is precisely in pushback to what they view as the decline to secularism. They say things like, bring God back and all of life's troubles will be fixed. But many of you know, growing up with this, much of those beliefs can be quite precarious, and it leaves with more questions than answers, as we have discovered on our journey here at Q. So what did some of the famous philosophers think about nihilism and meaning? Well, let's take a look. Number 1, Friedrich Nietzsche. He was a pivotal figure in the development of modern nihilism. He famously declared that God is dead, and I'll explain that in a second, recognizing that the decline of religious authority in the modern world left a profound existential vacuum. When he used the term God is dead, he wasn't meaning it in a way God is dead, as in like some sort of anti-religious speech. He was referring to that after the Enlightenment, as we moved more into, the age of industrialization and individualism, that as we moved away from religious institutions, God was no longer at the fore of people's lives, and therefore it left this kind of emptiness of meaning, and that's basically what he meant by that statement. In fact, Nietzsche was very critical of the Enlightenment, despite celebrating it for this very reason, and believed that it was the cause of nihilism's rise. You see, for Nietzsche, this void posed a critical challenge. Without the divine, without a higher moral code, what are we left with? In this world of perceived meaninglessness, Nietzsche saw nihilism not just as a philosophical position, but as a social and psychological condition. Without an overarching purpose, the individual is faced with a cold and indifferent universe. So that's Nietzsche. Number 2. We then have Søren Kierkegaard. For existentialists like Søren Kierkegaard, nihilism was a deeply unsettling consequence of living in a world devoid of clear answers. Kierkegaard argued that the search for meaning was the fundamental task of the individual. However, he also acknowledged that without faith, without a higher transcendent truth, meaning could seem elusive and unattainable. And I'm going to drink some water now because Claire's going to be mad with me. So that's Søren Kierkegaard. Number 3, we have Jean-Paul Sartre. So Sartre also grappled with nihilism. He believed life had no preordained purpose or higher moral law to guide us. Yet, it did not mean a cause for despair, but a liberating realization. He introduced the idea of radical freedom, and get this, I love it, the notion that humans are condemned to be free. When I read that this week, it absolutely blew my mind. They are condemned to be free. And it made me think back to when Ant spoke about, and you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free. And we understood the core root of that word make was basically to forcibly impose upon you. Now, some of you will be terrified with that, the idea that you're condemned to be free, because free is such a wide thing. And when we're talking about the idea of meaning and certainty, it can make you feel quite vulnerable. When you live like this, there is no divine will to achieve, no blueprint to follow, but the freedom to create one's own meaning through choices and actions. There is a definitive link between meaning and responsibility to navigate the world authentically and without self-deception. In Sartre's framework, meaning doesn't exist externally, imposed by some divine or deterministic force. Rather, it is forged through our engagement within the world, and it is the individual's task to define their own purpose. In effect, the kingdom of heaven is within. So all of this begs the question, are we free to create our own meaning, or are we simply cogs in the machine of a predetermined universe? The question touches on the classic debate between what Danny spoke to us about quite a while back now, determinism versus free will. If every event, every action is the inevitable result of prior causes, then it seems that our lives are simply the unfolding series of events we cannot control. In this view, the search for meaning, in effect, becomes futile as we are locked into a chain of predetermination. Now, as society shifted into a more secular age, where religious structures no longer provided a clear guidance, the individual then becomes central in the search for purpose. The secular shift calls for a reevaluation of where meaning originates. Is meaning an object, something that you attain, or is meaning the realization that you yourself are the meaning of life? And finally, Ayn Rand. Rand offered a strikingly different version. For Rand, the individual is the ultimate creator of meaning. Her philosophy of objectivism is grounded in the belief that reality exists independent of human consciousness, that human beings, through reason and rational self-interest, have the power to shape their own destiny. She emphasizes that meaning is not something handed down from a higher power or dictated to by society, but rather meaning is created through one's own values, actions, and choices. For Rand, the highest moral purpose is the pursuit of one's own happiness, achieved through rational thought and individual achievement. Now, if you are brought up in a world where altruism and sacrifice is the highest moral value, it's very difficult to accept this premise. Unlike the existentialists, who focus on subjective meaning, or the religious, for example, who find meaning in mysticism and divine purpose, Rand proposes that individuals must take responsibility for creating their own reality. She argues this is the very reason we finally emerged from the Dark Ages. Her view is very optimistic and empowering. If life is meaningless, then we have the freedom to shape it however we choose. It's a blank canvas, a blob of clay to be molded. The pen is in your hand, and you are the sculptor. The individual is the architect of their own existence, and in this process, meaning is forged, created, and ultimately lived. And so, I will leave you with this fundamental challenge. If life has no inherent meaning, how do we navigate our existence? You see, people turn to faith, not just in an idea or principles, but a blind, uncritical faith, taking away the responsibility to think. Freedom is found in the wrestle with complexity, uncertainty, and contradictions. Ultimately, I personally feel the loss of meaning is linked to the abdication of responsibility. Thinking can be difficult. Doubt can be uncomfortable. Holding one's ideas to scrutiny takes effort. It's a deeply personal quest, but one that is fundamental to finding one's place within the world. So I will leave you with these final questions before Emel takes us into the next chapter. What does meaning look like to you? How will you choose to shape your own existence, knowing that you have the freedom to define it? And in a world that may seem meaningless, how will you create your own purpose? Thank you.
Right, so that song very much captures the way I think and my outlook on life, yet whenever I share things like that, any thoughts or even that song, it's always been met with, oh gosh, that's terrifying. And so I think this idea of being insignificant can be quite unsettling for some people, because if nothing matters anyway, that isn't great. Like, why are we here? What's the point? But I find it really liberating and quite a beautiful thing. So hopefully by the end of this talk, you can try and see and maybe even understand my point of view a bit better, even if you don't believe it. So I've broken this talk into two sections of things that I do or say. The first section is something I say to others and act like an act that I do myself whenever I feel myself getting lost in man-made stresses. I tend to tell people to look up at the sky, because looking up at the sky reminds me of the scale of the universe. It gives me this grand perspective. I can't even comprehend how far away the clouds are, or the stars, or the moon. So that makes me feel quite small in relation to everything else that's up there. And that reminds me of the temporary nature of humanity. See, we are the current apex species, yes, but we're also so fragile, and that can be terrifying. But this impermanence is what makes life special. The classic example of a sunset lasting forever won't be beautiful anymore because it lasts forever. There are so many times as well where I'm back in Turkey and I have to really take the moment to appreciate the view, because I know as soon as I'm back in England, I'm going to be like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I took all of that for granted. So memories are beautiful because they're fleeting. Youth is beautiful because it's fleeting. And I think life is beautiful because it's fleeting. I talked to my mum about this topic of the meaning of life and nothing matters. And she said something that was really kind of hit home to me. She said, death gives meaning to life. She explained how death really changes your outlook on life, because when you experience a loss in your life, all of the stress from the previous days just disappears. You think, why was I so worried about work? Why was I so hung up on how I acted in that social interaction, how I come across to other people? All of it just seems so small, because in the end, none of it really matters. And after death, after experiencing such a great loss, the world just keeps on spinning, as if none of it mattered. So, what matters to you? Imagine if I've taken everything away from you: your job, your family, your friends, your hobbies, your creativity, your intellect. If I took all of that away from you,
What matters to you? What are you begging for me to give back to you? So I'd like to give you 10 minutes or so to discuss your thoughts on your tables. I've added a couple other questions on the screen to discuss too. So the other questions are, when was the last time you felt small in the grand scheme of things? Did that feeling unsettle you or bring you comfort? And if everything is temporary, what does that change about the way we live our lives? Does impermanence make life more meaningless or less meaningful? Goodness me, more meaningful or less meaningful? So I'll give 10 minutes to discuss that, and I'll be back to talk about how nothing matters anyway, and that's great. Cool. So what I found really interesting is that I think it's funny how it feels like we can only really appreciate what we have when we compare it to having nothing. We live in such a noisy world, as Joel kind of hinted earlier, and it's filled with people telling us what to think, how to act. We've got opinions and rules that seem to contradict each other, and all this noise all around us every day. And it's really difficult to strip all of that away and just think about what really matters to you. And last week we were talking about the feeling of being watched and how that can stop us from misbehaving. But I also think that being watched can stop us from experiencing joy and the sense of freedom that that can bring. So have you ever had that time of your life dancing and singing away in your own little world, and then somebody walks in and all of a sudden that just shuts down? I think this phrase like dance like nobody's watching, I think that phrase to me is as freeing as saying dance like nothing matters. But if nothing matters, then what's the meaning of life? Well, this goes into another thing that I say quite often, is life is what you make it, right down to the neural connections in your brain. So essentially the idea there is that we control the structure of our brain. So a good example of that is the London taxi drivers. So the London taxi drivers have to memorize thousands of different streets and different shortcuts. And this means they have a larger hippocampus. And the hippocampus is the area of the brain that's responsible for memory. And similarly, musicians have greater connections in the areas of the brain responsible for fine motor skills and hearing. So when I say life is what you make it, I say life is what you make it right down to the neural connections in your brain. And I think the meaning of life is also something that we make ourselves. So I think the meaning of life is not inherent. I don't think it's something that's given. I think there is no universal meaning of life. There's no objective meaning. There's no spectacular answer that we have to go out and discover. I think it's something we create. So one of the freedoms that comes with insignificance, so if nothing matters, then we get to decide what matters to us. If there's no grand plan we have to follow, that means our time is ours to enjoy. We can create the meaning of our own life. Now, I can already hear some of you thinking, yeah, but if we create the meaning of our own life, what about people who say their meaning of life is to get drunk and live in a ditch, or to rape or murder or commit genocide even? Yeah, what if? But some people even claim that that's God's will, that it's God's will that they commit these acts of hatred. And they might not even see it as an act of hatred, they might see it as an act of duty. Now, I don't agree with it. I wouldn't want to live my life like that. But when you bring like harming other people into it, it always gets a bit confusing, and it gets quite difficult to say, actually, no, you're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to harm people. But then again, who am I to say that isn't their meaning of life? Who am I to say whether it was given to God, given by God, or if they created the meaning themselves? Who am I to say, no, you're wrong, that isn't your meaning of life? Do we even need to have a meaning in life? Can't we just be? Does everything really have to have a reason? I think we'll have another 10 minutes or so to discuss some questions before I say some concluding thoughts and we finish with a little song. So, do you think the meaning is something we create for ourselves, or is there a deeper universal meaning to life? Which idea feels more comforting? How does the idea that life is what you make it apply to your own experiences? Can you think of a time when taking control of your own narrative changed your perspective or emotions? And do you think life has to have a meaning? Would you feel comfortable with the idea that life has no inherent meaning and that we're just here? I'll give you 10 minutes to discuss. So I wanted us to talk about one more idea before I concluded, and it's just 3 words that I came across this week, but they form an interesting sentence that you can break down quite nicely. Choose your delusion, which apparently is also a song that has these lyrics, which I find pretty cool. If I have to be deceived, I'd like a lie that I conceived. So I thought that was pretty cool and interesting, but back to choose your delusion. So if you focus on the word choose, do you think the meaning of life is given to you, or is it something you actively choose? Or is it something that's already within you, waiting to be discovered? If we must choose, that means we have agency, we have a little bit of freedom, but we also have responsibility. Now, some people spend their whole lives searching for the right meaning, afraid of making the wrong choice, but what if there is no universal answer? What if meaning is not something waiting to be uncovered, but something we craft through our actions, our beliefs, and our way of seeing the world? Now, if you focus on the word your, do you think the meaning of life is a universal thing, or do you think it's something personal? Because I think the meaning of life is yours. It's what matters to you. I don't think it's a singular truth that applies to everyone. I think it's personal, and I think the things that make life meaningful to you may be completely different to what makes life meaningful to someone else. And that's okay. So no 2 people see the world in the exact same way. Your purpose, your values, your reasons for waking up each morning, they belong to you and you alone. So maybe you don't have to fit into someone else's version of meaning. Maybe you get to create your own. Here's another interesting concept that I came across this week. It's a little quote that says, "We are given a blank canvas that will, in the end, contain an image of how we lived our whole lives. We can paint anything we like on this canvas during our lives. It ends up being our own creation." And I think that colourful canvas, your own creation, is the meaning of life. The meaning of life is not a rule book handed to you. It's a canvas, and you don't have to follow someone else's design. You get to paint it yourself. Now, if you focus on delusion, this is a controversial perspective that I have, but we often think of delusion as a bad thing, something to avoid, and it's something false. But what if instead it's just simply a perspective, a way of seeing? Every meaning we create is ultimately just a story we tell ourselves, and yet that doesn't make it any less real. I think we live 2 lives, one external and one internal. Reality, as we experience it, isn't just what happens around us, but what happens within us. We build our own worlds, our own relationships, passions, beliefs, the thoughts we choose to believe. We don't experience the world objectively. We experience it through our perceptions, our emotions, our stories. Now, some people live their whole lives chasing an objective truth, but what if true meaning comes from the subjective, our own rich internal world? Maybe we all live by a delusion of some kind. Some people choose religion, others choose love, art, adventure, ambition. Some dedicate their lives to helping others. Some pour themselves into their work. They chase experiences, they chase knowledge. Some chase happiness. Are any of these right, or are any of them wrong? Or are they all just different ways of giving life meaning? So perhaps we live our own meaningful delusions, and through them shape reality itself. So before we close, I just wanted to touch on a couple questions that you can discuss. So break it down. So choose. If nothing inherently matters, does that give us more freedom or more responsibility in choosing what matters to us? Do you think the meaning of life is a universal thing, or do you think it's personal? And delusion, this is a big one. What is reality to you? So I'll give you like 5 minutes to discuss that. I'll close with a little conclusion, and then Danny will hopefully sing a song for us. Conclude. We often talk about the meaning of life as something to find or discover. But when you get there, then what? If the meaning of life is something to attain or achieve, you might never get there. You might get there next week. And if you do get to the meaning of life, then you either say, well, now what? Or you move on to another goal or the next step, which does not completely reduce what you've worked so hard to get to. So it seems very unlikely to me that the meaning of life is something to achieve or attain, because that just leads to a dead end. It seems much more likely to me that we live in the meaning of life. Instead of endlessly questioning or chasing purpose, if we align our actions, our thoughts, and emotions with what we already find meaningful, then that is the meaning of life. That's what matters to us. We embody the meaning of life, moment by moment. And in that sense, life itself becomes a meaning, a bit like what Joel was saying earlier. Meaning is not something we have to discover, but something we create by how we live.